The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to rise today on behalf of the New Democratic Party to oppose vote number 1 in the main estimates, the appropriation of $57 million for the Senate of Canada, and to urge my colleagues in the House of Commons from all parties to do the same. We simply can't keep giving them money, Mr. Speaker. It only encourages them. And I put it to you that while we may not have the authority to unilaterally abolish the Senate, we can cut off their blood supply, curb their activities, and limit the ability associated with this wholesale waste of money and abuse of power. Let's face it, Mr. Speaker, Canadians have just about had it with the upper chamber, and the Auditor General's forensic audit to be released tomorrow is not going to improve the public's opinion of this outdated, undemocratic, vestigial appendix of colonialism. In short, the jig is up for the Senator of Canada, Mr. Speaker, and no amount of tinkering is going to convince Canadians that it's worth preserving. And no amount of bafflegab from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister is going to take the stink off of recent developments in the Senate of Canada. And I want to know the question that I didn't get a chance to ask. Why did the Parliamentary Secretary end up making this speech instead of the person that moved the motion to adopt and to fund this appropriation, which is the President of the Treasury Board? It may be revealed later in the day. This latest round of expense account shenanigans may be the catalyst for the public's latest outrage, Mr. Speaker. Stories of wretched excess and gluttony never fail to offend the sensibilities of hard-working Canadian taxpayers. But the pure patronage pork of Senate appointments process since its inception has been unworthy of any Western democracy, and it is a disgrace. Greg Thomas of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation calls it a wretched bordello of backscratching. But there are more serious reasons why the jig is up for the Senate and why we should not only cut off its funding but find a way to abolish it altogether, and I will address those reasons as we go forward in tonight's debate. I want to say at the outset, Mr. Speaker, there's a great history and tradition for the member of my riding to oppose the vote in the main estimates funding the Senate. The former member for Winnipeg Centre, J.S. Woodsworth, began efforts to abolish the Senate and oppose its funding when he was first elected as the member for the Independent Labour Party in 1921. Woodsworth opposed funding for the Senate because he knew what the Senate stood for and why it was really created. It was created to keep the democratically elected House of Commons from passing laws that may have a deleterious effect on the interests of capital and the wealthy. Sober second thought meant curbing the misguided ambitions of the great unwashed, like you and I, Mr. Speaker, in the lower chamber, who may seek to legislate in the best interests of ordinary Canadians, not just in the best interests of capital. He knew that the Senate is not just an expensive nuisance. He knew that it was an obstacle and impediment to democracy. Now, apologists will tell you that the Senate is there to protect the rights of minorities. What they don't tell you is the minority that they're talking about is the rich and powerful elite. In the words of Sir John A. Macdonald himself when debating the creation of the Senate, and I quote, "We must protect the rights of the minorities, and the rich are always fewer in number than the poor." Mr. Speaker, it was created as a check on the democratically elected chamber in case they got too uppity. And in the first decades of our history as a nation, the Senate vetoed almost half the legislation the lower chamber sent up to them. And J.S. Woodsworth and the Independent Labour Party got burned themselves by the Senate. And I want to share this example with you, Mr. Speaker. In 1925, the Independent Labour Party offered to support the minority Liberal government of William Lyon Mackenzie King in exchange for one simple thing, a promise to create an old age security pension. Mackenzie King agreed, and a famous letter sealing the deal is on file at the NDP headquarters on Laurier Street as we speak. The legislation was passed by all stages through the House of Commons, only to be rejected in 1926, vetoed by the Liberal-dominated Senate. The will of the people, as expressed by the democratically elected members of the House of Commons, was thwarted and undermined by the unelected Senate, and as a result, Canadians went into the Great Depression with no old-age security. It should offend the sensibilities of anyone professing to be a Democrat if the will of the people, as expressed by their democratically elected representatives in Parliament, can be vetoed on a whim by unelected, self-serving partisans appointed by the ruling party. And that's what rubbed the Reverend J.S. Woodsworth the wrong way. And as early as 1926, there is record of him calling for the Senate's abolition. J.S. Woodsworth, as many of you here will know, went on to become the founder and the first leader of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the predecessor to the NDP, and so it should surprise no one that at their founding convention in Regina of 1933, they called upon an amendment to the British North America Act to abolish the Senate. The Regina Manifesto, it's worth remembering today, reads in part, "In its peculiar composition of a fixed number of members appointed for life, it is a standing obstacle to all progressive legislation, and the only satisfactory method of dealing with the constitutional difficulties it creates is to abolish it." When J.S. Woodsworth passed away in 1942, the good people of my riding elected another United Church minister and long-standing advocate of the social gospel movement, the Reverend Stanley Knowles, and he remained MP for Winnipeg North Centre for 42 years. And during that time faithfully continued the tradition established by Woodsworth of trying to defund the Senate as an interim step towards its ultimate abolition. He put forward motions and bills to abolish the Senate at least 18 times that my research can find, and I'm proud of the history and tradition of the Independent Labour Party, the CCF, and the NDP in my riding of Winnipeg Centre. And Mr. Speaker, I can say with all humility that every day that I take my seat in the House of Commons, I am very aware of the honour that is mine to stand in the footsteps of these two such great men, two of the greatest champions of social economic justice and democracy that this country has ever known. And so it's a great honour for me to uphold the Winnipeg Centre tradition of opposing any further funding for the Senate in the main estimates of this year or any other, and to work towards the day that that institution is abolished and excised from the Parliament of Canada once and for all. Now, I'm not going to indulge today, Mr. Speaker, in any bashing of individual senators, because notwithstanding some ethical lapses by some, the real problem lies with the institution, not with the individuals. As Stanley Knowles said in 1964, after the Senate killed a bill to fund the unemployment insurance system, many members of the Senate are decent and even outstanding Canadians who have rendered a great service to their country. That is not the issue. The issue is the power they possess. He went on to say the Senate of Canada, whose members are appointed for life, as they were at the time, has greater powers than those of any such body in any democratic state. The British House of Lords can delay passage of a bill for no more than 1 year. The Senate can veto a Commons bill year after year till the end of time. The House of Lords cannot reject or even delay a money bill. Our Senate can, and just did with the Unemployment Insurance Bill of 1964. Should non-elected people be in a position to veto or delay the will of those elected by the people? I believe they should not, and that is why my party and I have long favoured the abolition of the Senate. Mr. Speaker, I was reminded today of Michael Gorbachev's reaction when he was touring our Parliament with Eugene Whelan, and how stunned he was that Canadian senators were not only appointed, but appointed for life. He was shocked, according to the Toronto Star. A member of the Politburo in a communist dictatorship was aghast at what an affront that is, just as we all should be shocked. It's unworthy of any Western democracy. It's an embarrassment, and it's a national disgrace. The appointment process has offended Canadians perhaps even more than the bogus expense claims, and no Prime Minister in the history of Canada has abused the appointment process as much as the current Prime Minister. It's ironic and perhaps even poetic justice that his first broken promise to Canadians, "I will not appoint unelected senators," has now come to be perhaps his greatest headache, his greatest liability, and hangs like a great stinking albatross around his neck. He has appointed 59 senators and counting. It seems like it didn't take him long to learn, like other prime ministers before him, that patronage is the KY jelly of politics. You will remember, Mr. Speaker, the notorious day when, in an absolute orgy of political patronage, he appointed 10 failed Conservative candidates, the campaign manager of the Conservative Party's election campaign, the president of the Conservative Party, the communications director of the Conservative Party, the chief fundraiser of the Conservative Party. Pretty much the whole war room of the Conservative Party's election campaign were appointed to the Senate as one big fat F-U to the Canadian public. And there they could continue their purely...
Order. The honourable member for Edmonton Centre on a point of order.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know my honourable colleague is known for his colourful rhetoric and his extreme language, but he's going too far with references to lubricants and references to, clearly not very thinly disguised references to foul language. I really request that he keep it a little more dignified in this place, despite his tendencies.
There's no question that the last comment was clearly unparliamentary. I've asked the member for Winnipeg Centre to withdraw it.
Mr. Speaker, on your request, I'd be happy to withdraw, and I would replace the word with one big fat insult to the Canadian people, if that's more palatable to those present. And there, Mr. Speaker, that whole group, the whole Conservative war room, could continue their purely partisan activities with a $140,000 a year salary, staff, an office space, incredible travel privileges. It is wrong and unfair on so many levels, Mr. Speaker, I don't even know where to begin. And the Conservatives are by no means alone in this. The Liberals have been equally guilty over the years of stacking the Senate with their political operatives, so the partisan activities of the party are passed on to the taxpayer. It is an abomination, and it's an affront to democracy.
An affront. Good word.
Mr. Speaker, earlier I referred to the early years of our democracy when the Senate would veto much of the legislation passed by the House of Commons. I spoke about how the Senate arbitrarily vetoed J.S. Woodsworth's Old Age Security Pension Act of 1926. We spoke of the Senate vetoing funding for the new Unemployment Insurance Act in the 1960s. You would think such a thing could never happen today, Mr. Speaker, but you would be wrong. I refer you to Bill C-311 in the last Parliament, Jack Layton's Climate Change Accountability Act. For 5 years, over 2 minority parliaments, Jack Layton massaged and encouraged his climate change bill through the lower chamber, only to have it unilaterally and arbitrarily struck down in the Senate without a single hour of debate and without a single witness being heard. Now Canada, at the G7 discussion on climate change, hangs its head in shame because there's nothing to bring to the table. No legislation has ever been brought forward on the subject of this existential threat to the world, and it's no wonder Jack Layton called the Senate outdated and obsolete, a 19th century institution that has no place in a modern democracy in the 21st century. I refer you also to the member for Wellington Halton Hills and the very modest Parliamentary Reform Act that he hoped and encouraged members of Parliament to adopt. I believe the vote was 270 to 17 in favour in the House of Commons, and sure enough, it's gone to the Senate to die. I believe, I put it to you, we will not see that bill succeed in the 42nd Parliament. The third bill was already mentioned by my colleague from Windsor about the bill that you put forward, I believe, Mr. Speaker, from Windsor-Tecumseh, a bill on sports betting, languishing for 3 years in the Senate, probably never to see it again. And the last one is from my colleague from Esquimalt, Wanda Fuga, a bill on transgendered rights, an important bill that was, again, nurtured through the House of Commons, a very real social issue, again, dying an unnatural death in the Senate. So, Mr. Speaker, after years of failed attempts and a frustrating Supreme Court ruling, Senate reform is now sitting squarely on the too-hard-to-do pile. The Prime Minister would have you believe that there's no appetite amongst the provinces for what he calls another round of constitutional wrangling. But how would he know? He's never called a First Minister's meeting. He's never asked them. It's been 23 years since we had a go at amending the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. Does he think that's too frequently to consider the well-being of our federation? The Constitution is supposed to be a dynamic document, a living, breathing thing, not static and rigid. I think the Prime Minister is wrong. I believe there is a real and growing appetite for reopening the Constitution to discuss any number of things, from interprovincial trade to revenue sharing to the Canada Pension Plan to, yes, even the future of the Senate of Canada. Now, I took part in the constituent assemblies leading up to the Charlottetown Accord, led by Joe Clark. I was one of the ordinary Canadians that wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail, and 160 of us were chosen to learn more about the Constitution of Canada and to embrace some of the issues that the Federation was facing. And I can tell you, it's a healthy exercise to take the pulse of the Federation from time to time and to try to address the legitimate concerns and grievances that inevitably grow in a federal system of government. It's healthy to come together to reaffirm the resolve that it takes to keep our loosely knit Federation intact. It was a worthwhile and important effort that almost had me convinced that the Senate could be fixed. I no longer believe that. I now share the view of the Premier of Saskatchewan that it's irredeemable. It should be abolished. Mr. Speaker, let me close by quoting once again Mr. Greg Thomas of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in his recent article in the Toronto Star. The Senate is a disgrace to Canada. The Senate doesn't make our nation better, it makes it worse. An unelected assembly of landowners has no legitimate right to rule over the rest of us, no matter what the Constitution says. The Senate is a constitutional institution, but so was the slave trade in Britain in the 19th century until it was abolished. Democracy in Canada would be enhanced by abolishing the Senate. So I say to my colleagues through you, Mr. Speaker, by voting nay on vote number 1 of the main estimates tonight, members of the House of Commons will put this issue on the national agenda. I urge members present to vote tonight, reflect on what is best for our democracy, reflect on what your constituents would want you to do, and vote accordingly. And I suggest that leaves you with no choice but to vote no on vote number 1 of the main estimates 2015-2016. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question come on side. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to note, I know previously the member had suggested that we couldn't talk about expenses, but in the very first sentence of his speech, or the very opening remarks of his speech, he referred directly to Senate expenses as an issue. So I think that that I will seize upon that later on in debate to ask some very specific questions with respect to expenses. But something that troubled me even more in his remarks, I think that we have to get to, because this is something that the Leader of the Opposition has not wanted to talk about, but this member stated in his speech, and I want him just to be very clear on this. He suggested that it is policy of the NDP that they would, if they ever form government, begin constitutional negotiations as a priority, constitutional negotiations to open up the Constitution to talk about how to reform the Senate. I wonder if the honourable member could confirm that that is a priority of the NDP, to open up constitutional negotiations, and if he could highlight for me which premiers and what premiers have told his leader with respect individually. Each of the individual premiers have told them their positions would be on that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the commitment has been, and it's been made very publicly as recently as this weekend, that the Leader of the Official Opposition would consult with Canadians for the purposes, and consult with the premiers for the purposes of finding collective interest in abolishing the Senate and meeting the requisite numbers where the Senate could in fact be abolished as per the lower chambers, that all the provinces that used to have second chambers have gone bicameral. Those will testify and admit that their legislatives, their lower chambers, were not diminished by abolishing the upper chamber. In fact, they were strengthened. But the mandate of senators comes into question too, Mr. Speaker, and it needs to be addressed. That is part of the problem that we're facing today and part of the abuse that we're going to hear declared by the Auditor General when he releases his report tomorrow has to do with the fact that the mandate of senators as they see it is so open-ended that the mandate of a senator is anything the senator deems to be his mandate, his or her. So they're spending money freely without any oversight, without any scrutiny, without any control, even by the ruling party. Now, the ruling party has senators in their caucus. Surely the ruling party could exercise some control over those senators so they don't abuse the system and abuse their expense accounts. Where's the accountability on the part of the ruling party and the Conservatives?
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Saint Laurent, Cartierville.
Thank my colleague for a very rigorous, vigorous and substantial speech. He seems quite enthusiastic about the idea to reopen the Constitution. I would like to know if he spoke on behalf of his leader when he said so, and when he said especially that the constitutional talks that he's considering would not be limited to the Senate, but would touch a lot of issues, like he mentioned, trade and many others.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
I think, thank you, to my colleague for the question. What I was referring to was how much I enjoyed the exercise leading up to the Charlottetown Accord. What an honour it was as a carpenter by trade to be chosen as an ordinary Canadian and going through what was an incredible learning experience, learning about the fabric of our country. And as my colleague knows, the Charlottetown Accord was not limited to the future of the Senate or the reform of the Senate, although substantive recommendations were made. If my memory serves me, the Accord proposed that each province would be assigned 6 senators and each territory 1, and additional seats would be added for the representation of Aboriginal peoples of Canada, an idea that we borrowed from the country of New Zealand, where the Maori have representation, and that elections would take place under the federal jurisdiction at the same time as elections in the House of Commons. Those were interesting developments arrived at by consensus building in 6 meetings across the country, talking to ordinary Canadians. The initiative failed, but at least the government of the day didn't put it on the too hard to do pile. They embraced it as an issue and as a subject that Canadians wanted to talk about.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague for his very thoughtful and passionate speech. It's no surprise to Canadians out there that hard-working Canadians who pay taxes are very, very concerned with what is happening in the other house. And they're also questioning very strongly, that's what I've heard this weekend while I've been in my riding, what is going on. My question to my colleague is that we had a Prime Minister who actually said he wanted to do away with the Senate. I want him to express now how the Conservatives have failed to deliver on a pre-election commitment that the Prime Minister often made.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre. Order.
Well, if the heckling has died down, let me just say I've thanked my colleague for the question. The Conservatives have dropped the ball on the Senate, and I share the frustration. I mean, you've got to give them credit for trying. I think they did try. I went with the Prime Minister on the day that he introduced the bill in the Senate regarding limiting the terms to eight years. I was curious to see how it would react, or how the public would react and the Senate would react. The fact is, it's now put on the too hard to do pile. He's washed his hands of any commitment to reform the Senate. I remember when the old Reform Party used to bring out the Mexican hat dance and the mariachi band and play outside of the Senate, criticizing those senators that spent all their time on the beach in Mexico. That was when you had people who were committed to reform the Senate, and we joined them in our enthusiasm. But the fact is, what we're voting on tonight is to send another $57 million to the Senate with no more accountability than the last pile of money that they abused. This is what Canadians have to ask themselves. Do they want us to spend their hard-earned tax dollars this way? And if so, why? And I urge all members of Parliament, deep in their own conscience, are you accurately really reflecting the will of your constituents if you're voting in favor of funding the undemocratic, unelected, under indictment Senate.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Windsor West.
Speaker, I'll be brief, but the reality here is exactly what the member for Winnipeg Centre has said, is that we're voting on $57 million of expenditures to the Senate. So it's up to their choice to figure out after the vote whether they want to show up to work or they don't. But the fact of the matter is they haven't passed motions and also legislation here in the House of Commons. So I asked the member, why should we actually spend $57 million more? $57 million reason for Canadians.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, thank you to my colleague from Windsor, but Canadians may be even more concerned that the total budget for the Senate is more like $90 million. The House of Commons gets to vote on the $57 million, and vote number one is appropriations for the Senate. Some of their funding is, in fact, statutory. But the fact is, Canadians are wondering why they're paying anything for it. Not only has there been a pattern of abuse, but they serve as an undemocratic barrier to the will of the people as expressed by those elected representatives in the House of Commons, time and time and time again. 133 examples the researchers at the Library of Parliament found for me where bills were vetoed by the Senate which were passed in the House of Commons. Nobody elected these guys to make legislation, Mr. Speaker. They should have no right to interfere with the will of the House of Commons. They certainly should have no right to generate bills. More and more bills we're dealing with in the House of Commons, you may know, are not called C-51. They're called S6 or S13 or S33. They're originating in the Senate. Here we are dutifully debating bills that they generate in the other chamber. It's completely upside down. It's completely absurd. If Canadians think about it, it's an affront to democracy and everything that's good and decent about our notion of democracy. Now, John A. Macdonald, when he first crafted the Senate, to cut him some slack, he was 2 years away from the American Civil War. He was looking south of the border thinking, you know, we can't give too much authority without some checks and balance, or God knows what could happen. North America was traumatized. But that was not the last century. That was the century before that. We don't need to be bound by the limitations of John A. Macdonald's thinking when he made that terrible quote about how we must protect the rights of the minorities and the rich are always fewer in number than the poor. Seriously, you guys.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. The honourable member